Okay, so there's one further thing to mention. One thing that actually a lot of Tech 2 industrialists don't even know. So if you look at any of the intermediate reactions, so the first stage, and if you look at the material rarities, or if you're like me and have done Tech 2 and therefore literally just remember them all off by heart, you will notice that they all consist of a material of one rarity and then a material of the rarity above that. So to show literally tungsten and platinum, if I go back, you will see tungsten and platinum, right? So one material of the rarity above, or I guess you could say one material of the rarity below, but it doesn't matter either way, right? And you might have seen that some of these reactions here on my screen are called unrefined, and you might think, what's that? So like, you can have unrefined rolled tungsten alloy, and you also have rolled tungsten alloy. So what's the difference between these two? And there is actually a pretty big difference. So as you can see, rolled tungsten alloy as an input takes 100 platinum and 100 tungsten, of which the platinum is the rarer material. Yeah, and if you look at unrefined rolled tungsten alloy, it takes in still 100 tungsten, but now it takes 100 atmospheric gases. And atmospheric gases is 2 rarity levels below platinum, or 1 below tungsten, right? So instead of the materials requirement being an R8 and an R16, it's actually an R8 and an R4. And that sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? Because the amounts haven't even changed, and you're using a much less rare material. So obviously it will cost a lot less, or at least it might look that way, but there will be caveats that come up later. So this whole reaction just looks pretty weird. For starters, the duration is doubled. This is a 6-hour base, reduced with skills, and it only gives out one unrefined rolled tungsten alloy. And obviously this isn't just one rolled tungsten alloy. Actually, when I show you the reprocessing for this, it'll be quite interesting, because if I reprocess this, I get this back. And at first it might even look like you could get free tungsten out of this, because 164 tungsten, 100 tungsten in 164 hours, that's pretty good, isn't it? But this is a reprocessing, and this is a scrap metal reprocess, which, by the way it works, the scrap metal reprocessing always has a base of 50% output, and with skills can be increased to a maximum of 55%, and nothing else will change it. There are no structures that will change it. There are no rigs or anything that will change this percentage. And as I can show you, that very thing here is the reason this character has scrap metal processing 5, is to do those reactions and to reprocess those materials at optimal rates. So this reaction here, as I said, it's looking pretty good, isn't it? Because you use a much less expensive material in the same quantity. Of the more expensive material that you use, you receive a lot of it back. So for instance, I think 55% of that means that you will lose something like 12 per run. So this says 100, but actually when you take into account this being returned, this costs basically 112. So this is looking really cheap now, right? And then you will get this times 55. So these are called, actually, the technical CCP name for these is the alchemy reactions, which is quite weird, but literally nobody knows that. People call them the unrefined reactions because they are literally unrefined normal output, so unrefined rolled tungsten alloy, as opposed to just a normal rolled tungsten alloy. As opposed to just a normal rolled tungsten alloy over here, you have unrefined rolled tungsten alloy. So these reactions you do need to be aware of as a T2 industrialist, because they often provide ways of circumventing very expensive materials that may be very expensive in the meanwhile. If any of you know what technetium is, well, obviously you do because it's a material, but if any of you know specifically the history about it, you know why these reactions exist. They were basically created so that technetium would never happen again. And I mean, I guess they've done their job, there's no OTEC 2 or anything around. So the thing to be aware about these reactions is that, now as you saw the output, the reprocessing output of that unrefined tungsten carbide was only 36, and that you only get 55% of that, so something like 14, right? And of course the real rolled tungsten alloy gets you a whopping 200. So in order to get the output of one of these, doing just unrefined, you need to do a lot of unrefineds, right? And this may or may not be profitable. So the things take into account is that it take a lot longer. Like, not only is each reaction longer, but you're doing a lot more of them, so it's a lot more time. The material list can start to build up, so like, while this is quite cheap, you're using a lot of atmospheric gases, so that can start to build up a lot. You use a lot more fuel blocks, because the other one also takes 5 per run, but you're doing a lot more runs of this, so that's a lot of fuel blocks, and that has a dual effect. Fuel blocks are expensive, but they're also hard to move around. So, you know, I could fit all the...
Draxcatlo SB00N entered channel.
I can fit all the moon materials to build something like 100 ships, probably in a BR or something. It's not a lot, but once I include the fuel blocks, it becomes a lot. So the fuel blocks are the majority of what you have to move around as a Tech 2 industrialist. And so if you don't have a strong local fuel block supply, these are not very feasible, because you'll end up needing a lot of fuel blocks to get the equivalent in unrefined, right? But still, they can provide very good ways of circumventing expensive higher level materials by just using loads of not as expensive smaller scale materials. And even the tungsten, which isn't the rare one of the previous one, even that you use in very small quantities because you get some of it back, right? So that's like a big aspect that I get a lot of T2 industrialists don't know about it. It's very useful. For instance, I think Hexite is the one that is pretty much always better to do unrefined. For instance, this is obviously the sort of thing you need a spreadsheet for. You simply have something that adds up what you need, how to get it with refined or unrefined, calculates all the costs, etc. I will show you that later. But certainly there are sort of things to be aware of. These are also, again, when they say you need a lot of ords, if you're going to do something like this, you really do need a lot of production capacity, because they're very slow. So if you don't have a lot of slots, and if you don't have good time bonuses, these will crawl along, and as I'll show you, they still crawl along. So now, everything I've told you is sort of mechanics, but it's always good to be aware of how these things sort of actually add up in terms of numbers and sort of what the practical effects of this might be. So I'm going to show you this, which is a spreadsheet of mine. Oh god, it's going to do that. Give me 5 minutes. Configure audio wizard next.
This is an example of
Hello. Okay, so
this is
okay, so I changed it quickly so that doesn't happen. So ignore this for now. If you look at something like this, for example, you can see the difference between doing refined and unrefined, and the various sort of time differences. So if you look at this is in hours. So if I were to do cerium cadmide unrefined, it would take me, that's probably like a month in raw hours. Obviously this gets reduced a lot with skills and with splitting it across multiple alts and etc, but this is always worth noting. And even then, for a lot of these, it actually does cost more to do the unrefined method, simply because of the large quantity of fuel blocks that happen. So these are all losses, for instance, these -1s. But for a couple, for instance, as you can see, you start to save a lot. This is saved per hour, so that's a bit weird. The total amount you save is this. So for instance, on this particular order, which is 100 hulks, this is just an example order. For 100 hulks, you would save 159 million. Doing this during ferrofluid, the unrefined manner, you would save 174 million. Doing disprite unrefined, you'd save 180 during hexite unrefined, for instance. This is currently set to no, because even though it does save a lot of money, it does not save a lot of time. And well, none of these save time, but you know, it's to do with how much extra time you want to take on as opposed to how much money. So even though a few of these could be positive, for instance, they won't be taken, although some of these are negative. So ultimately a lot of this comes down to spreadsheets. Like, it's good to know how things work. So for instance, this is a visualization of the first step, the intermediate step. So we have all the moon materials up top, all the things at bottom, And so it's good to sort of know mechanics and things, but ultimately you need to build yourself, or I guess if you're a bit later, just steal one of the quite a few publicly available ones. Build yourself something like this that does all the math for you, because this is not sort of something you eyeball. Even the sort of traditional method of avoiding spreadsheets, which is to just build loads of things and allow sort of aggregates to make things work out, tends not to work very well, because you need to decide sort of refined or unrefined, and again, that's not something you can easily choose without just knowing the numbers and how do the numbers add up, and you can't really do that in your head. So yeah, what can I say? Build yourself a spreadsheet. You need to keep track of all these things. So to sort of somewhat recap reactions, you have a starting point of moon materials that come from refined moon ore. Yeah, there are then sort of two branching paths. You can go refined or unrefined. Both lead from raw moon materials to the intermediate step, right? And they're both sort of separate. So those are both two alternate pathways to get to that intermediate step. And then from the intermediate step, you'll react them into composites. That there's no sort of unrefined composites or anything like that. That's just that. So that's sort of what you need to be aware of. That sort of for the first step, you can pick two, and sometimes you'll pick one, sometimes you'll pick another. And knowing that there are unrefined to pick is very useful, because they'll, as I've shown you, they'll save a lot of money in rare situations. But most of the time you will be doing the normals, if only for the time save, which can be, as also demonstrated, massive, and also for the shipping costs and problems it saves you. So you do need to be aware of that, and then from that onto composites. So